Okay, everyone, if you could take your seats, we're going to kick off the next session. Over to Nicola, who's chairing it.
Welcome everyone to the final session. So this is by far the most important session of the day. We're going to be talking about resilience, and because it's the most important session of the day, we have the biggest panel of the day and the most diverse panel of the day. So before we start, let me just kick off then. Yeah, hopefully that's good. So I started off the day this morning by talking about the scale of the challenge ahead. I'm not going to reiterate that now, but I think a key point that I want to make is that even if we achieve net zero, we're already facing enormous impacts from climate change today. We're seeing that all around the world. We're seeing wildfires in the US, in Greece. We're seeing just recently a massive heat wave in India, the probability of which has increased more than 50-fold because of climate change, shown by our great researchers in Imperial College. So these risks are real, and they are now. And even if we meet the most ambitious view of the pledges that were made at COP26, and this is the most optimistic view, we're on for about 1.8 at least degrees of warming. If we take a view based on the commitments that have actually been made, so the actual policies that are in place today, we're still on for well over 2, getting towards 3 degrees of warming. So thinking about how we manage those risks and building that into financial systems today is absolutely critical. And why is finance so important in this? Well, it's important if we take the global view, first of all, because I tend to think globally about these things. You imagine that some of the key drivers of resilience as a society are things like our infrastructure systems, our food systems. We've heard about natural capital. That's a key driver of resilience. And again, the financial decisions that we're making today over infrastructure, for example, over how we're structuring our food system at the moment, will really determine our resilience for decades to come. If you imagine, we don't even know that infrastructure investment is about 2.7 trillion a year is going into infrastructure. Compare that to all adaptation finance, about 60 billion a year. So we're outpacing, our infrastructure investment is outpacing our adaptation investment by about 50 times at the moment. So we really need to move away, I would say, from this paradigm of thinking about adaptation as something separate, to think about how can we really build risk and resilience into the way that we're making our decisions on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of some of the challenges on adaptation, the Climate Change Committee, about this time last year, the Adaptation Committee showed that the gap between the risks and what's happening on adaptation in the UK is actually widening, and that's even in the UK, where actually we're fairly well prepared and we're investing a lot. We know that risks are currently underpriced. These physical risks are underpriced across the system. We know that adaptation investment is not coming anywhere near where it needs to be. And when I speak to institutional investors, a lot of them, they don't even know where to start on adaptation. It's a real challenge. But what I want to talk about in this session in particular is also thinking a bit beyond adaptation. That's why we called the session Resilient Transition. Because when we think about risk and resilience, it can't just be about climate. All of these things are interconnected. Climate risks, water, food, ecosystems, everything is interconnected. So I really want to push towards thinking about resilience in a much more interconnected way. To give a little plug, at COP26 we launched a paper called Aligning Finance with Resilience. So what would it mean if we had an equivalent to our alignment of finance with net zero with resilience? How would we do that? So we set out a conceptual framework to do that. It's actually one of the Paris goals. Paris Article 2.1c isn't just about mitigation, it's also about climate resilience, and it tends to be, for some reason, not given the same prominence at the moment. So I really think we need to recognise that these interconnections between systems, the shocks that we're seeing globally at the moment are key sign of that. We see these compounding risks at a national level. We take India, for example. The risks of the heat wave were compounded by increasing energy prices, which meant it was very difficult for them to cool themselves down. So all of these risks into play, and we really need to start thinking about them as in that interconnected way. And also the risks that we see ourselves as firms, as individuals, we're only as resilient as a society as our least resilient amongst us. So actually, we need to start thinking about systems, and how we build resilient systems, and how the actions that we're each taking are actually supporting the resilience of the whole system, because it will, unfortunately, come back to bite us if we don't. A final plug I want to give is particularly around the role of data, which is obviously CGFI's big focus. So one of the key challenges that we have on adaptation and resilience at the moment is that we don't have this sort of common language of risk and resilience. It's very different to net zero, where you have one clear goal and a clear set of metrics. We have a challenge that, how do you actually quantify resilience? How do you quantify risk? One of the key initiatives we have, which Ben mentioned at the start, is the Global Resilience Index initiative, which is trying to provide that globally consistent risk information, completely open to all, to level the playing field. And I think these types of initiatives are what we need really going forward as a basis to build more resilience as a society. So in this panel then, what I want to do is, by the end of the panel, convince you that resilience is the most important thing, is the most important topic that we're going to discuss today. I want to.
Well, we all agree with you, Nicola.
Yes.
It's these guys who we need to convince.
So we need to convince you. We want to look at what we know about the risks today, the physical risks today, and where the gaps are. Look at how we can actually mobilise more finance into this area, and then finally what it means for the green finance strategy, where adaptation and resilience was weak in 2019, but what would it look like for it to be strong in 2022, 2023? So without further ado, then I'm going to come on to my excellent panel. So I'm going to allow you each to introduce yourselves as we go round. And as you introduce yourself, to give a little opening pitch on one opportunity that you see on the topic of resilience, and one worry that you have on the topic of resilience. So firstly, I'm going to come to you, Rowan. Rowan Douglas, head of the Climate and Resilience Hub at WTW.
Well, I guess that sums up why I'm here. I'm head of the Willis Towers Watson Big sort of insurance risk advisor and investor. Great day, actually. I mean, I'm particularly pleased for today because some of us were roped into the Green Finance Task Force chaired by the late Roger Gifford in 2018. And I think Emma and I were roped in to be the resilience people. And theme 2 was all about resilience, and the recommendation that was picked up was the private sector, academia and government should establish a Centre for Climate Analytics. And that was picked up in the Green Finance Strategy the year later by NERC and UKERA, and here we are. So just goes to show that the UK can pull things together, and it's a huge achievement that it's happened, and great that obviously the consortium's being put together. The worry I have is that when you're dealing with sort of net zero and macroeconomics, you can go from the top down. Resilience is a wee bit different. You've got to cook from scratch. You've got to go from the ground up. And some of us in the sort of geographical world and the insurance world have sort of realised this. But it's really challenging. You do have to work from the sort of atomic level, not quite atomic level, but certainly the asset level upwards. And it's not just about the hazard, how much the wind will blow and the storms will blow and the floods will rise. It's the exposed assets, populations and their vulnerability. It's really tough stuff. And I think now that this is beginning to dawn on the wider community, and there's a concern that for those who haven't been in this space, it's all so difficult. It's not so difficult. There's an incredible amount of work already being done, but we do have to go from the ground up. And I think the role that the centre is going to play and to enable that quickly to occur, because top down in this space just doesn't work, because global and local vulnerabilities are factored by the weakest link in the chain. I don't quite understand where we have a 4-degree projection if nothing changes at the end of the century. And we all know that's the end of basically economies and civilization. But when you look at the reports, it's a few percentage of GDP here and there. It's not how it works. It's going to be things that break. On the positive side, we spend about 30% of our GDP globally on risk-sharing systems. We call it welfare, we call it social insurance, about 8% is the insurance sector itself. We are going to require a revolution in risk pools and risk-sharing systems to protect each other locally and globally through spatial and temporal scales. It's actually sustainable risk pools and risk-sharing systems which will be like the cockpit that allows us to navigate a resilient, just and transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rowan, and thank you for your ongoing support and leadership in this space. So now to you, David, if I may. David Carlin, TCFD and Climate Risk Programme Lead for UNEP-FI. Your opportunity and your worry.
Yeah, well, first it's great to be here and to be on this esteemed panel. I wonder about the order of those things, whether it's good to start with the worry and then go into the opportunity. I feel like want to leave people at the glass half full. But I think the two are very linked. And what I would say is maybe starting with the worry, actually. As you said, Nicola, this is a topic that we have a race to resilience along with our race to zero, and yet we've heard so little about commitments to resiliency. And I think that that's one of the big challenges. It's not just the scale, but also the fact that there's so little private sector money in the resilience space, and especially in the areas of the world that are most vulnerable. This is where we are utterly falling short, and I think it really requires a completely new interpretation of our social operating model and our social contract with this. In the same way that we said, okay, just measuring your own risks is not sufficient. You need to get to net zero because that is the socially acceptable outcome and that is the requirement for many institutions. I think we need to similarly reimagine resiliency in the same way, to have adaptation plans, to have a clear view that your work is not done as a corporation or a society until you have considered resiliency, until you have brought that into your practices. And I think that to me needs to come part and parcel with the work that goes on mitigation. As far as the reality here, to drive it home, I think what's so important is resiliency and the impacts of physical climate change are kind of the hinge within the system. These are the destabilizing effects that make it hard for governments to function, that make it hard for societies to function. We saw the examples of droughts in Syria, but we've seen continually conflicts over water that are likely to intensify both in Africa and Asia, and also even to the extent that you see expensive litigation in the US Southwest on these topics. These are things that will only intensify, and in a world that needs cooperation, societal breakdown, disorder, inability of governments to provide basic services is going to make it a whole lot harder to reach those mitigation goals as well. So to me, I see resilience as being right at the center of all of this. This is the thing that is going to directly affect people's lives today and tomorrow. When we talk about committed warming, when we talk about committed impacts of climate change, what we're really talking about are people whose lives are at risk, and the determinant is not going to be what emissions path we follow. We still need to do that, we can't leave that aside, but we know that we're going to have worsening physical effects, and we know that we're experiencing them today. The fact of whether people will lose their lives and livelihoods, and how many, will have a lot to do with the decisions we make around resiliency. So to me, that is the crux of this, and that is why I see resiliency as both such an unappreciated issue, but also so core to keep the global mechanism functioning in a way that will drive meaningful change.
Thank you very much, David. So can I come to you now, Chiara Taraki from British International Investment, managing the climate change team, for your view.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. So indeed, Chiara Taraki from BII. I'm managing the climate adaptation and resilience building block of our climate change strategy, and very much committed to the topic since many years. So I must admit that there are two main opportunities that at BII we are pursuing. on the one hand, very much supporting and steering our capital towards those companies offering solutions to context-specific physical climate risks in those areas that need the most. The second opportunity that we are pursuing is very much to strengthen, to take any chance to strengthen the capabilities of our investees to identify, assess, and manage physical climate risks by identifying those climate adaptation and resilience solutions bespoke to their specific needs. I think that the key worries to very much enable us to achieve our strategy, but also to empower other investors to follow suit, is very much on the one hand to overcome those regulatory failures and policy gaps that are kind of hindering the incentive of investing in climate adaptation and resilience solutions. Just to give you an example, I see many early stage companies offering key water efficiency solutions in highly water scarce context, but the regulatory environment there for incentivizing investments in water efficiencies are not there. Or climate parametric insurance is another key opportunity, but many companies are lacking the data that they need to structure such products and also offer them. Another key challenge that I see is very much around capabilities, knowledge, and more specifically the availability of decision useful and usable data and information at the right time that can be very much integrated into the investment decision making processes of investors, and that can be also transferred to project developers that can very much integrate those in the development, construction and maintenance of infrastructure assets. Hopefully I didn't provide a too gloomy picture, but I stop there for now.
That's absolutely critical. Thank you so much. So from the developing country, emerging economies, which you know is a key passion of mine, back to high finance with you then, Ben Carr at Aviva. Can I invite you to share your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, thanks very much for the invite to speak at this event, I think it's your first annual forum, so fantastic. I work in the actuarial function at Aviva. It's a large insurance company, and I think at Aviva, we're dedicated to protecting our customers from homes and properties from extreme weather events. That's what we do, really. Whether it's flood, windstorm, or wildfire. And we've got access to very granular level data to do that. We've got sophisticated models, and we've got, which we can use for pricing, underwriting, capital management. And those data models can also help us to actually help customers when they're facing a significant event. So we can actually get out in front of events and support people as a result of that. So in some ways, there's a positive story about how we're managing those types of events today, and we are already supporting and can support people and making sure things are being resilient. But definitely what we know about those models is they currently cannot they're not properly calibrated to think about how those events are going to change over time, how they're going to become more extreme. And we see that as one of the sort of key challenges, as well as an opportunity. We produced a report this year looking at how you can build sort of more resilient future communities in 21, particularly looking at property. And again, we pointed to a number of ways in which we think government can help to support that and help build those more resilient communities. So, some very simple examples. One is we continue to build in floodplains. We need to stop doing that. We need to change building codes so we don't build in floodplains. We need to start to make it much more, when we have events, we need to make sure that we're actually supporting people to actually invest and make their home, build back better, and make sure their homes are more resilient for the next event. Again, governments can play a role in supporting that through grants, etc. And then finally, we need to really deal with the insurance protection gaps. There are still large areas where people can't get assurance or affordable assurance, and we need to work with governments and others through public-private partnerships to ensure that people can get cover where they need it going forward.
Thank you very much, Min. And then you raised the important issue of data, and there's few people better in the place in the world to talk about that than Demo from Risk Thinking AI. give us some solutions, and what do you see as the challenges?
Yeah, I've got all the solutions that's in my pocket, but a lot of stuff has surfaced here, right? And in particularly as you opened up with aligning finance with resilience, I think that's really touches on the heart of everything. You know, private finance is not going to come into resilience unless people can measure properly. You know, I think you need standards. Investment will flow when you have data, standards, proper measurement, particularly as Ben put it, into the future. This is all about the future. So it's very hard for anyone today to understand what the trade-offs are. You know, you don't have infinite cash in the UK or in the States or anywhere to do everything. So the question always comes, where do you allocate the capital? And so give me the data. How can I actually measure what the risk-reward trade-off would be for a particular? So my company, Risk Thinking, is really dedicated towards uncovering the right data you need to do this. And we start with a very religious view that you cannot solve this problem deterministically. It has to be a stochastic solution. You really need to uncover the uncertainty. And so we start by uncovering the uncertainty of every risk factor in every location around the world. And our project is now pretty advanced. I mean, we have in about 33 billion locations all the risk factors from the past and into the future on climate, as well as the economy. So we represent those by distribution. So imagine in every location in the world having all the distributions of all the factors that could affect an asset. So once you have that, you start getting to a basis where you can start measuring trade-offs. And I think that's going to be at the crux of solving this problem. So you asked about opportunities. I think we have a big opportunity as a company because we have really assembled probably the first stochastic view of climate. And it makes it very easy for us to work with CGFI. When you publish all the cement factories in the world, we can immediately analyze them. My big worry is more on the regulatory side of things. If I look at what's going on in the world today in terms of measurement, which prompted us to do what we do, I see a deterministic view. I see deterministic solutions, even though they might be couched in stochastic form. In other words, there's often the language of, I will pick a scenario and do X, tag in a Merton model and draw some distributions. You can't pick scenarios. God picks scenarios for you. So scenarios, I think there's a real problem, not just in what data, but how to even understand what to do with data. I mean, my hair stands on end when I see what people say when they're talking about scenario analysis. You can't pick scenarios, and that's the language that we have to get rid of. So my big worry is that the regulators are going to come in and bless some of these methodologies that will lead us down the wrong path. I don't think we're ready for regulation yet. I think we need it badly. But it should be more on the lines of the BIS regulations for finance, where we're not going to tell you what models to use. We're going to tell you if your model capability is good enough. And so if you don't, as banks, the BIS would penalize you if you didn't have a good enough model team. We need that kind of carrot and stick around regulations. So anyway, that's my big worry and big opportunity.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Kate, but I was going to flag to Ben. I'd love to hear you respond to the point on regulation, actually, given your background on that. But I'm first going to come to I'll even give you a moment to think about that while I come to Kate. Kate Lamb from the CGFI. So we've heard a lot today about water and the importance of water, and that is absolutely critical to resilience more broadly, one of the biggest impacts of climate. So tell me about your work and also what we can do in this space.
Sure, thank you. Hi everybody. You all still awake out there? Can we get a show of hands just to check? Excellent, fabulous. And you all now think, of course, that resilience and adaptation is the most important thing, right? Show of hands. Oh, okay, we'll improve on that by the end of the panel. So yes, my name's Kate Lamb. I'm the Global Director of Water Security and Oceans at CDP. We're a not-for-profit organisation that have been running the only disclosure mechanism for corporations to report climate, water and deforestation related risks and opportunities, and we will continue to do so, expanding into oceans as well. I've been working on water for a decade, and my worry is that we are too late in so many of these issues. A recent report from the World Water Development Report from the UN suggests that 2/3 of UN members don't even have basic drought monitoring and warning systems in place. 2/3 of governments around the world. That means there's a vast majority of the global population that are going to be, including ourselves, unprepared as droughts continue to hit and worsen. That's terrible. My biggest concern on top of that is that we lack ambition, to speak to the point made earlier by my peer. While we see a load of institutional investors standing up and shouting loudly about the need for the race to resilience and to succeed and win on that, when was the last time you saw a coalition of institutional investors calling about the need for more ambition on adaptation and resilience, or indeed on water security, or while we see some on deforestation? We need your voices to come to the table and shout loudly about the need for more government ambition on adaptation, because the reality is it is government's job to solve for this problem. You have a very significant role in calling for more ambition, but also in aligning financial flows with resilient outcomes. So, okay, we heard earlier about the potential for investing in resilient projects. That's vital, I think, but if you're not undertaking due diligence on your investment practices and your loans with regards to physical climate risks, or water insecurity, or the destruction of nature writ large, then you're missing an opportunity to make sure that even if it's a non-traditional, a non-climate related intervention, that investment regardless should be resilient to changes in climate and the natural environment. Miss that, you're missing significant risks and opportunities, and we'll be ill prepared for it. So why am I optimistic? What's the opportunity? I think it is that we are waking up to this issue. And I hope that at COP27 we will see more institutional investors standing up, shouting for more ambitious action on adaptation. And if you're not, I will come and find you and make sure that you are on the panel shouting for this. Because if we get it right, we will enhance livelihoods today. Just the top 50 water utilities in the world serve over 1 billion people worldwide, just 50 companies. So if you all get out today and go and work with those companies and make sure that they're putting climate resilience plans in place, that they're looking at adaptation of their infrastructure, then you're going to enhance the ability of 1 billion people to have a more resilient, prosperous life. And that's a direct intervention that you can have today. So there are lots of very simple, straightforward things that we can do. Yes, amazing models will enable that to take place in a more meaningful way, but that shouldn't be a reason for inaction today.
Thank you. And I think, so in this next discussion, I really want to focus on the solutions. And I think one of the reasons why not as much progress is made potentially on adaptation resilience is that people see it as really hard. They see it as, what does that mean? Where do I even start? And so I'd really like in this next discussion for us to come out with some key solutions that we can push for. And I love I completely agree that financial institutions need to be pushing government on this and pushing internationally. Maybe if I can come back to you, Rowan. So you were very successful in getting your CEO onto the big panel at COP26. So what can we do, particularly at the sort of board level, to really get resilience into the minds of the key decision makers in companies and in governments?
Yeah, well, Actually, there is one initiative at the moment around investors and resilience. Well, I'm sure there's more than one, but the one that was you were referring to, Nicola, it's called the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and it's got quite a large group of investors, credit rating agencies, large engineering companies, and really it's to do, in a way, what Ben and the insurance community did, which was get the physics into finance, i.e. how do you get physical natural hazard and moving into future climate risk into the DNA of decision making. I've seen over the last quarter century how it got into the DNA of insurance management. I'm afraid the word resilient, sustainable and green was never used. It was purely about risk and return. And that same approach is beginning to be adopted into the world of investment. But the nitty-gritty is, until you can show, and I think GRI, CGFI, the initiatives will help do that, until you can show how the physics gets into finance, how physical climate risk is an input to credit risk, or legal liabilities. So as insurers, we have a legal duty of care to be resilient to the 1 in 200 year maximum losses. Ron, the industry spends $2 billion a year on stochastic risk modelling. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how and broadly speaking, it's gone from ruin to resilience. We need to put a forward gear on that gearbox and broaden its scope and include a broader range of technologies, but it's a great solution. We now need to go, with the help of the CGFI, into the gearboxes of every other financial sector and then link that with regulation. I think that will be the way that actually the invisible hand of economics is retrained to protect lives, livelihoods and assets and be the steward of the transition we need. And I think the building blocks are there, we just need the orchestration. And we need, frankly, to take off some of our tribal hats within finance and treat us all as a collective endeavour. And I think that's why I'm so excited about this centre, because I think it does allow us to kind of forget our own little cottage industry of finance and learn the best from investment, from reinsurance, from all the other parts of the jigsaw, and bring in new thoughts too.
Ben, if I can come back to you then on the financial regulation point, because I know you've spent years working on insurance regulation. So maybe I can ask you to respond to Ron's point about what needs to happen in terms of regulation, but also your views on what is it, because what's happening now on regulation related to climate and things like the scenario analysis of the Bank of England is quite different to what's happened in insurance. And how do you see those, like, what are there lessons from insurance that can we come across into this new area of climate regulation, financial regulation, can we say? And what did you learn as well from the recent CBES exercise? So there's a lot of questions to you.
So I think in terms of CBES, let's start with CBES, that's quite concrete. So we were one of 10 insurers, and there were 10 banks as well that completed the CBES exercise. It was based on 3 scenarios, so it was not stochastic, it was deterministic, and there were 2 transition and 1 physical risk scenario. And I think that exercise was powerful in helping to build capability. It was powerful in terms of making firms think about these risks and how they might impact their balance sheets, whether it's on the asset or the liability side. And we certainly found that the outcome from that was that, as along with other insurers, that it was the physical risk scenario that was the most impactful, not the transition risk scenario. It wasn't exactly the same for banks. So some of the banks, they were actually, some of those disorderly transition scenarios were almost as impactful as the physical risk scenario. But for insurers, it was the physical risk scenario. And the real driver of that was actually losses on the equities and bond books of insurers. So it wasn't on the insurance liability side, because they tend to be quite short term, tend to be able to reprice, tend to reinsure the tail risk. It was on the asset side and the impacts on corporate balance sheets. And that was coming through physical risk modelling, thinking about 3 ways in which physical risk models and physical risk could impact corporate balance sheets. So one is quite straightforward, which is you look at the assets of the company, the facilities of the company, and you think how climate change, physical risk perils, whether they're chronic or acute, could impact the value and the performance of those assets. But then there's two other areas. One is thinking about impacts on supply chains of those companies. And then the third is thinking about impact on their markets, services that they provide, and how they could be impacted by physical climate change. Now, I think we're starting to see some modelling coming out which can deal with that first point, which is this impact on company facilities. It's quite sophisticated modelling. You need a lot of data, but you can start to do that. But we still see there's quite a big gap in terms of thinking about supply chain impacts, and there's a big gap in thinking about how this will impact your products and services, your markets. So I definitely see those as a big gap that is still coming out of this exercise. But it does help people to start to size risk, to start to think about what are the key drivers and how they might what management actions they could take over time to start to sort of mitigate those risks or reduce the impacts. So I do think it's been useful, and I think the regulators deserve some credit for forcing people to start thinking through these issues, developing the scenarios. We talked about the NDFS scenarios earlier. I think they've been a really useful and powerful tool for getting people to think about the risk. But I would agree with Ron, there is a bit of a danger in thinking that you can assess all of the risk just with 3 scenarios. So we're used to looking at, in our economic capital model, we look at 500,000 scenarios when we're looking at the 1 in 200. And just looking at 3 potentially means you don't see the real risks that you're exposed to. It certainly doesn't help you to identify what types of event might really knock a particular company over that you're invested in. It doesn't really help you to potentially think about some sort of tail events that could occur, so not just sort of central scenarios but tail risks. So I definitely think we would see that as an area that's going to develop. We're going to see more stochastic modelling, as you say, and people are going to want to have a much richer set of scenarios to analyse the risk. I don't think that regulators are opposed to that at the moment. So I don't think that in many ways they set up the scenarios in quite a deterministic way because that was the only way you could do it practically. But I agree, it's important that people are aware that there are some potential dangers if you really push that too hard and rely too much on the results coming out of those types of exercise.
A quick follow-up question, but I mean, so coming back to Rowan's point about the need to bring risk into the DNA of financial decision making, do you think is that beginning to happen now on climate change, that it's being brought into risk pricing, decision making within financial organisations?
I mean, I think that certainly a lot of people are now setting net zero targets. So I think climate is becoming part of the strategy. But my experience is at the moment people are tending to use simpler metrics to embed and manage that risk from a strategic perspective. So, and often those are what we call inside-out metrics rather than outside-in. So an inside-out metric is thinking about what's the impact of my actions on the environment, the global economy. So, for example, if I reduce my carbon-intensive investments, then that's reducing emissions. What's the implied temperature rise as another metric people look at in my portfolio. But those are inside-out metrics. They're not telling you what's the risk of climate change on my business, which ultimately, if you want risk-based pricing, you need those outside-in measures. And I don't think those are so embedded at the moment. And that's where that type of stochastic modelling becomes really important.
Well, we've actually seen a lot of stuff come to our way just recently on exactly the point you're raising, which is how do we price climate risk into the market? And that's exactly the subject. I'd say about 80% of what we're doing now is developing those pricing tools for large numbers of assets. So I firmly believe that before we get to the point where everything that you see on a Bloomberg terminal or a Reuters terminal actually encompasses climate in that, we won't be able to do a lot of what we're trying to do here. So I think the number one target from what we're thinking is to actually price climate into the market. So how do we do that? And that begs the question of how do you get the data, how do you get the standards, how can you... those are all open questions. And in order to do what we do, we have to develop standards. In some sense, we develop our own standards, and hopefully they grow. But one gets to this point very, very quickly. When you want to organize all that data, you have to be able to align that data geospatially. You have to align it with climate science, what makes sense from a climate science point of view. And you need then the financial engineering to actually develop the products that are needed. But I can tell you that at least 2 banks that we're working with are asking us to help them develop financial products for mitigation and adaptation. You know, what can they offer their clients, helping them with the mitigation? I think it's a very big topic. I don't think it's a sideline now. I think it's really mainstream. People are really there. We've worked with some of the biggest infrastructure people in the world. They're not only asking, what's our risk, you know, what's the risk to me, but also, how can I better select my next investment, you know, to take into account climate. So I'm pretty optimistic on that level, but, you know, not so optimistic on hitting 1.5.
No. And of course, I think, again, looking at mitigation is vital, but we shouldn't conflate low carbon with resilience, right? And anybody who's currently following that trajectory is going to be sorely disappointed when the shit hits the fan or the floods hit the walls of your factory or farm, because that is clearly not the case. And we're seeing all the time this conflation happening where the pursuit of net zero is at all costs will be the thing that will save us all. But if you look at water, if we bring water into the mix, because it's my bag and my baby, you know, the raw ingredient of green hydrogen is, anybody?
Water.
H2O, exactly, H2O. And yet, the world is facing a shortfall in supply and demand of freshwater resources of up to 58% in just 8 years' time. So if you're running if the world is running at deploying green hydrogen or CCS, which again, very, very water intensive as a means to achieve our mitigation plans, and we fail to adapt to or think about the implications of the changing well beyond climate, because let's also remember that if we were able to solve climate change tomorrow, we would still be facing a natural catastrophe from an environmental perspective, right? Groundwater resources are continuing to be depleted beyond the point of renewal. Water quality that we're dealing with is unfit for human consumption and touch in many parts of the world. Those things would still be in place whether climate change was happening or not. So if we continue down this avenue of carbon or climate blindness, mitigation blindness, and planning for those scenarios where we're not bringing natural environmental limits into that as well, then we're at risk of being non-adaptive, maladaptation activities, and an economy that is still facing very substantial risk. We are very clever individuals. Yes, it's difficult, but we can do this. We can solve these problems if we're asking the right exam questions from the very beginning.
I completely agree. I think one of my gripes with a lot of what we're doing on risk at the moment is we focus very much on there's this individual property, it's at risk from flood or it's at risk from windstorm. But that's not where the big risks are really going to come from with climate. They're going to come from water scarcity. They're going to come from destruction of heat.
Yes.
They're going to come from disruption of ecosystems. So all of these big risks that we're not really thinking about at the moment when we're doing our physical risk assessment, which are just missing, and that means they're not being priced and the incentives are not being built into the system.
But if I may, there's also a risk of when we are in a position when we do understand that, because of that inside-out perspective, the activities, the actions that we then promote firms to take, whilst they might deliver resilience for the company, for that factory, for that farm, we risk very much that factory or farm being a clean fish in a dirty pond. They're resilient, but everybody else around them in the river basin or the country or the community are very much not resilient. So the perspective that CDEP is bringing to this, or is attempting to understand how do we move this forward, is not only to understand and measure is the company itself resilient, but are the activities it is taking not undermining the ability of the community that it's housing it to also be resilient. Because again, if that happens, the company itself is going to be faced with a plethora of risks, and we're just in this spiral of negativity, which none of us want. We want spirals of positivity and upward trajectory and movement and growth and all of that other lovely stuff.
So in terms of spirals of positivity, I know to David. But before I do, let me warn you that I'm going to start asking for some questions in about 2 minutes. So you have your questions ready. But now, spiral of positivity. I'm going to come first to David, and I've been so excited recently to hear that CGFI is getting into adaptation. And so tell us about what you're doing with banks in particular and others on adaptation.
Yeah, so in hopes of being a spiral of positivity for us all, one of the things that we're really looking at is the role that financial institutions can and should play within adaptation. And I think one area that there's a lot of things I've heard on this panel that I very much agree with around the need to consider the distribution both of impacts and pathways. I think that's a limitation of a lot of modeling. We need to think not just about single assets, but rather holistically and in a systems way. I want to maybe shift things a little, and I think this ties into the work that we're doing, but also perhaps offers a solution to your earlier question about what are the solutions out there. I think in some ways adaptation and resiliency can be connected to physical risks, but also be somewhat separated in terms of the opportunities provided. And what I mean by that is there is tremendous need around the world, both close to home as well as further abroad, for renewal of infrastructure, for the construction and development of programs, facilities, assets that will build resiliency. And that's, I think, one of the nice things is while it is immensely complex to think about these challenges and think about the uncertainties in the climate system, there are certain things we know with great simplicity improve resiliency and improve outcomes. Many of them are very much correlated to the overall capital in a society, to the overall capital that is being put into an operation on this subject. But when I think about things like ensuring clean water, ensuring clean power, some of these are going to be about whether you're experiencing a 1 in 100-year flood or a 1 in 200-year flood. But many of them are about a deficit in this infrastructure, a deficit in assets that promote resiliency needing to be addressed. And that regardless of whether you see a flood of 8 feet or 10 feet, again, showing my American background, I'll give you 2.5 meters or 3 meters for you guys in the audience. What I'm saying is that understanding the risks is obviously of critical importance, but I would also say there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in this space around what needs to get scaled up and what needs to be done today to make us more resilient. And it may not just be the height of the seawall. It may be the transport network. It may be the existence of a transport network versus not. And these are the things that I think are the difference makers in terms of the risks that we already have baked in. So to say I love the thoughts around the complexity of modeling and exploring the data, and I really enjoy that. But I think for everyone here, there are also things you can do today. And I think it's important to balance those. And unfortunately, you don't get to choose, similar with mitigation and adaptation. You don't get to kind of pick one or the other. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people saw mitigation, saw this was this big lofty goal, but now we're kind of coming back to you guys and saying, by the way, you have to think about adaptation too, and nature also. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, these things are not optional. They are only cumulative and interconnected, but happily, I think some of the solutions can be too. So providing clean power in an emerging economy can be both an effort that supports resiliency, supports leapfrogging and carbon mitigation, and supports the continued functioning in that society of equitable solutions for those living there. And so just to say, I think we do have solutions both to hand as well as ones that we will continue to need to analyze and work on and think hard about too.
Yeah, just a real quick point. That's a really great point, because there's low-hanging fruit and there's the deterministic side of our world, the no-brainers that we should just absolutely do first. And I think that'll get momentum going. You don't have to wait for the all singing, all dancing solution. But there's so much low-hanging fruit that's so obvious in so many places that we tend to sort of ignore that. You know, I think in some sense the biggest thing we could do today to move things forward, apart from all the stuff we're talking about, is really actually articulate what the low-hanging fruit is and do it. You know, it's not about the best, most advanced solution, because that's a smokescreen for not doing anything. So I agree with you. Like, let's articulate what those that low-hanging fruit is, and let's go after it.
So, Kieran, crescendo of our spiral of positivity.
No, and actually thinking about those low-hanging fruits and also some of the barriers I mentioned earlier on, and the call for ambition. I mean, BII has been one of the co-founder and the co-lead of an initiative called the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Investor Collaborative, and we have been working with other development finance institutions, and not only very much to put forward strong ambitions about how we are seeking to move the needle in this space, how to address systemic barriers to private investment in this space, in developing and emerging markets. And actually last year we put forward an ambitious set of action to the G7 to demonstrate our commitments and to signal to the market what is the direction of travel. One of those actions is very much around strengthening our internal capabilities and the capabilities of our investees to systematically identify, assess and manage physical climate risks. And we are very much working together to strengthen our due diligence processes such that very much to integrate physical climate risk issues and resilience throughout the investment cycle. We are at different stages of maturity, certainly, but we are working towards the full integration across all the investments, also because we committed to implement the Task Force on Climate Resilience, the Task Force on Climate-related disclosure recommendations, and so certainly that is one of the core steps, as is taking the portfolio view and very much zooming into those key investees with whom we need to work harder and faster to enable them to invest in those adaptation solutions required. So there is positivities, there is passion, there is ambitions, and I'm sure that more investors will come along the way.
So I'm going to give you all an opportunity to ask a question. Do we have questions?
Gosh, let's see.
Lots of questions. Maybe we'll start with Eric. Maybe.
Thanks, Erica Thompson, LSE Data Science Institute. I'm always interested in conversations about resilience because it never really defines what it is that is supposed to be resilient. Clearly we don't want, for example, the coal industry to be resilient, coal extraction. So do we mean the resilience of people and communities, or do we mean the resilience of capitalism, Western values, where is it going? And so more broadly then, when finance takes up the cause of resilience, does it not sort of inherently and automatically prioritise the resilience of capital and the resilience of the wealthy instead of that of people, households, communities, nature, ecosystems? The previous panel identified the same issue with regard to nature. So it seems to me that the risk isn't failing to make profit, the risk is that we succeed in making massive profit but destroy the life support systems of half the planet in the process of doing that. So I suppose somebody said that climate risks aren't priced in yet. Maybe my worry is that climate risks are well known and they are already priced in, but that the resilience of capital actually acts against the resilience of communities, nature, ecosystems and everything else. So I wonder if the panel had any reflections on whether that vagueness about the targets of resilience are sort of deliberate, or semi-deliberate, or could the panel offer a more positive take on the inherent capability of financial solutions to support resilience, or is that mismatch just another barrier we have to deal with?
Great question. I want to take three to give my panel a chance to think about the answer to that question.
right at the back on the...
On the back. Sorry, I'll make you run upstairs.
So going back to some of the various questions that were addressed, I think from an insurance perspective, there is a challenge around obviously resilient building something and the concept of risk pooling. And going back to that concept of individuals are at risk, livelihoods, whole cities, ways of life, etc. are at risk. That concept of building that risk pool of risk tranching, if you like. And maybe at the bottom is the stuff that we all take for granted that has, say, marginal economic value that is critical. It disappears. And as an industry, we engage with policymakers, regulators, government around effective ways of mitigating risk either through policy or through direct financial contribution. So, for example, in the case of risk pooling in the insurance industry, is there a view, obviously depending on the modelling and identifying those systemic risks and those connected risks, as to a pool that is effectively managed by, say, some fiscal, or in the same way we have concepts of carbon tax, do we have a tax on physical risk, for example? And could you build a global pool, for example? Taking Nicola's point of, there is a disparity in terms of trade and wealth. Those risks have knock-on effects around the world, for example, at the Arab Spring. So the concept of building a reliable risk pooling in which there is an insurer of last resort, let's say, and to build a model framework around that. It'd be interesting to hear the panel's views on how that can develop and how you then influence policymakers to step in and take a tranche of that risk.
Three really great questions. I'm going to put them openly to you.
I'll break the ice if you like.
Please do, Aaron.
I'll break the ice. I'll kind of go dink, dink, donk. Because I thought that was the toughest question at the end, so I'll come at the end. Really important to understand, insurance and risk pooling is not a private sector activity alone. So, as I said, 32% of global GDP is spent on risk pooling. We call it welfare, we call it social insurance, 8% is the insurance industry. There is almost no purely private insurance system in the world. In the US, you have the NFIP. Australia is the only country at the moment with purely private natural hazard insurance. So we share risk locally and globally through taxation or through insurance premia or other mechanisms in capital markets. But ultimately, it's all of us as citizens sharing risk. We've got to figure out how to do that. That's a question of policy and politics. And what I think is so depressing is if we had been here in 1945, 1946, or in 1906, insurance as an institution of society would have been the most important political decision of the time. And somehow, over the last 60 years, this incredible cultural and scientific institution has been entirely devalued. And I'm sure our industry has got more than its fair share to blame for that. And maybe as we have to face this massive challenge, as we've had to face other big challenges in our economic and social history, that insurance will be rediscovered, but not just the industry. It's the thought of how to share risk, because actually insurance is a form of governance, deciding what we can do collectively and what duties we have to each other to have a collective future. So to your point, it's about how we will decide to share these risks socially and equitably. Because if we don't have a just transition, we won't have a transition at all, because political risk will destroy the capital that you've highlighted. Because at the heart of this is to disaggregate the view that private capital and social well-being is not linked. So some have heard this analogy from me before, but there are some fresh voices, fresh people in the audience. We cured urban fire in the 1870s in the West, which had been a scourge of investment over the previous millennia, but in the 1870s, cities grew, thousands were dying in America, in Europe. And it was decided that those investors should have those assets insured, and because of that, insurers decided that there must be zoning laws and fire departments and building codes. And through the boring rules of insurance, investment was reshaped so that urban morphology was changed. We have to do exactly what you're indicating and show the true value of capital and human rights of life, livelihood and shelter and some level of social equity are not diametrically opposed. In terms of a long sustainable future for us all and the stewardship of capital, these things are aligned. And maybe this issue can be the one that breaks that new mold.
So maybe I'll just build quickly on Rowan's really great points. And I think fundamentally when we talk about financing for adaptation, but also climate finance more generally, and the negotiations and challenges that come up every year and will come up this year at COP27, but have come up at the Biodiversity COP. These are all about how do we share risks and about the socialization of these risks and about what does an equitable sharing of those look like with this brilliant idea that we've had over centuries, but this idea of really avoiding the worst consequences for many by thinking of how that sharing can take place. And I think to divert and to lose focus from that, I think would be massively unfortunate. I wanted to talk about the first question though, and that would be the predominant area where I think about this, because I think one of the big mistakes that we've made is really thinking about climate risks on the unit of the institution itself and not on the societal level. And I've said this many times to people that what may be a relatively low risk for a board or for a firm may be not acceptable risk for society. And figuring out what that socially optimal outcome is, that socially efficient outcome, may diverge significantly from what works for a company. And in fact, you can see the opposition of these two things in the case of physical risk versus resilience. A management of physical risk could be as simple as moving out of areas where there are exposures to those physical risks. And that creates the kind of disinvestment that I'm sure all of us in this room and on this panel don't want to see. And I think what makes adaptation so tough is that directionality, that in some ways risk at the individual level can be managed down in ways that ultimately prove to be socially harmful. And I think that this is why I will finally repeatedly say what I mentioned before, that I think we do need to redefine this social contract, not just in the same way that good corporate citizens are ones that don't contribute to the worsening of climate change, but that they do need to do more, that adaptation is a responsibility, and to socialize that responsibility amongst governments, amongst corporations, and of course amongst the financial sector.
So we're standing between you and a glass of wine. So I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to make a final comment. I'd really like to get some key things out that we want to see in the green finance strategy, but you may use your time for something else if you prefer. Okay, allow me to start with you.
Yeah, happy to go first. And Erica, thank you for your question. It's for me the question of the day. I think the risk you highlight is a very real one. Indeed, we saw at the GrassFi conference when we could all get together in 3D before COVID struck, that under scenarios where climate risk or climate reality hit in terms of corporate supply chains, most corporate buyers left their suppliers high and dry at that moment and shifted away from those most vulnerable farmers, those most vulnerable suppliers that really needed their buyers to actually stick with them. And so that social contract between the buyer and the supplier is also something that needs greater attention. And I think the solution that CDP is bringing in this space, one of transparency, even if we don't know all the answers yet, even if we don't know exactly what good corporate practice looks like, just asking the questions of those firms around intent, around resilience for whom, how are you defining this, what actions are you taking, will allow us all as a community to move further forward and to continue to construct the most appropriate standards around defining what best practice on this issue should look like for the private sector. And I look forward to bringing that tool to all of our service.
I think we need to try and reshape dopamine flows.
We can do that over wine.
We can, but stay with me for a moment. So one of the things that always has slightly depressed me is that there'll be these big speeches on climate low carbon. It'll start with pictures of storms and wildfires and the big stuff. And then that'll stop, and then there'll be discussions about net zero, which is all great, but somehow, clearly, solving net zero creates massive dopamine flows for important people, and actually dealing with what they've just seen on the screen, which is part of the same continuum, somehow doesn't have the same dopamine, and maybe not the same serotonin of group. We need to find a way of changing dopamine flows. I think one of the problems is, with resilience is, the bottom line is, who in here enjoys going for medical? Who enjoys when they come back from medical and they've been to it? A bit better. The problem with resilience is, we all know we need a medical. And that, our countries need a medical, our institutions need a medical, and we all know it's going to be relatively bad news. So we're putting off the medical. And somehow we've got to have the confidence to have that medical, and then have the confidence that we're going to be able to get better and not just have palliative care. And to the point that was raised by Erica, people don't go for medical if they don't think the support is going to be there to help them get better. So somehow we've got to get everyone to have a medical, because frankly we've got the diagnostics. We're not perfect, but they're certainly better than nothing. And we've got to give people a sense that there's a dopamine fix to be part of the solution to this particular part of the climate challenge. And today has certainly helped my dopamine levels. That's all.
Thank you. I always find lollipops are a good
It's difficult to come after Rowan in final remarks, but possibly I think today's discussion very much highlighted the role and relevance of enhanced collaboration between public and private actors, very much to leverage the different levels of risk appetite and tolerance, and very much, enabling private investment to flow to achieve those social optimal outcomes, and also very much strengthen partnership with technical specialists and organizations like even CDP that can very much leverage data and bring the evidence that we require as investors to integrate in our investment decision making. And with respect to your point about the UK Green Finance Strategy, I think we have a key opportunity to demonstrate the ambition, to demonstrate a key blueprint that developing countries could actually, also follow in their run-up to COP. Thank you.
Yeah, so I very much agree on the point of neurotransmitters and reading. Don't even think about it as a book, that kind of gives a view on why we're not taking action and where it sits in our heads is I think really illustrative. On the green finance strategy, I think the thing that I would want to see top of the wish list is the clear identification of these no regret, urgent actions that take place, a sizing and an enabling of public and private actors to address them. And we can start nationally and then grow internationally. But to me, these are the things that need to be on the page today. And we know many of them. Let's see them codified. Let's see them acted upon. And then I think all of those longer term thoughts, projections, net zero, all of those goals, still have to be working on them. But to me, that is the difference makers in the here and now.
Well, I really liked Erica's question because it highlights what data and what pricing means, pricing into the market. To give you an example, a real tangible example, we're working with 3 banks and all of their mortgages, and we've matched our data sets with socioeconomic data sets. So it's very easy for us to identify houses that are at climate risk and social risk. And those are the ones the banks are asking us to develop new products for to enable them. I mean, I'd say that out of those 3 banks, and these 3 big banks in Canada, top banks, they have that social drive really built in. They want to do that. So they want to make those first few investments in how to make those people more resilient, because they doubly whammied, both social and if you look at the UK, you look at the US, you can easily find the areas that are socially deprived and climate. So the type of data that you would use and the type of pricing that you would use in an ideal market from our perspective is very broad. It's not based just on, some simple finance metrics. It's based on social good as well. So you can easily incorporate social good, and it should be. So you've highlighted the fact that our data needs to incorporate social data as well as climate data. It shouldn't be taken that when you price into the market, you're just sort of adding a little blip onto a credit rating. That's not what we mean.
Ben, it's all down to you.
So, I'd say, first of all, I totally agree. Thinking about insurance in its broadest sense and how insurance can play its part in supporting a resilient transition, I think is a really important takeaway for me, and I think the questions have brought that out really, really well, and the role it can support, in a whole range of areas, the transition. I think a couple of other points I'd make is really it comes back to your point about what does resilience mean. We clearly do still have this big issue that a lot of the negative impacts are not feeding their way through into company valuations. So the externalities are not being priced into company valuations. And that really is, we talk about it forever, but it really is a huge issue in terms of making sure that we get appropriate flows, financial flows supporting a resilient transition. I think transparency is also an absolutely key issue. We still have a lack of transparency around the risks and the data that enables us to really understand these risks and to price them properly. And then finally, I just think we need everybody, international standard setters need to be setting mandates for all regulators and bodies overseeing the financial system to make sure that they are required to make sure that their actions are supporting a resilient transition and supporting the transition to net zero. I think those are the things we need to really sort of make sure that we start to really get proper investment behind a resilient transition going forward.
Thank you so much. Well, it's nearly time to give our neurotransmitters a good boost. Before we do, we can thank our wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Now, the wine, I believe, should be that way.
Where's the gummies?
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. That was really great.